Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of From the Lighthouse. And we're doing something different this week in that we're doing a little bit of a meta podcast. We're talking about another podcast. So I'm here with my lovely co-host Michelle. Hi Michelle.
Hi Stephanie.
And we're also here with our excellent and very, very talented producer Jimmy. Hi Jimmy.
Hi Steph.
And we're talking today about the new podcast from the folks that brought you This American Life and the folks that brought you Serial, S-Town, which is really called Shit Town. And the reason that we wanted to talk about it today is because it's such a innovative use of the podcast format, and because it has spurned all this discussion about whether podcasts can be novelistic, and we'll talk about that issue today, I'm sure. I should mention up front too that this discussion will spoil you for S-Town. So if you want to listen to S-Town, please do so now before you listen to the rest of this episode, because you will be thoroughly spoiled and I wouldn't want to take away the experience for you. So, Michelle and Jimmy, S-Town, a podcast, the new novels.
Well, let me just start with an interesting story that leads into the whole spoiler thing too. Steph here, as lovely as she is, unwittingly gave me a spoiler, which I will forever resent her for, through no fault of her own. It's I've got a very, I guess, reading too many crime fiction novel has made me be a little bit of a detective when I listen to or read things. And so while I'm listening to S-Town, I was thinking, Steph mentioned that there's something shocking that happens at the end of episode 2. And because that thought was in my head, she didn't say what it was. All she said was that she gasped out loud
on the treadmill
at the gym.
Yep.
Made a complete fool of herself.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, what could be so shocking? And at the end of episode 1, I figured it out. I thought, he's going to kill himself. I thought that has to be the shocking thing, because he seems to be going through depression. He was sort of swinging from mood to mood, and I thought that has to be it. And when it happened, I was surprised but disappointed, because I really wanted to be surprised, and I wasn't, because I had sort of guessed it, and that got me thinking about, well, what I'm listening to is very, very similar to reading a book of some sort, because you don't like spoilers when you're reading books either. You kind of just want to be shocked by the entire experience and feel it throughout. And so I was a little bit disappointed that that part of my brain I couldn't shut off and just sort of enjoy the experience of it. And so I made a very concentrated effort when I recommended it to Michelle here of saying, I'm not going to say anything because it's better for you just simply be shocked. And all I told her was, just make sure you listen all the way through to at least the end of episode 2.
Mea culpa, I'm very, very sorry. I genuinely did not expect that. I sensed that the podcast was moving away from the kind of murder mystery that it starts off with in episode 1. I was seriously not expecting the suicide of John B. McLemore, and I am clearly an unattentive reader.
Look, I mean, I think your question about is the podcast the novel of the future, the new novelistic form, is an excellent one, because it really brings to mind both the fact that it's on one hand it's like a return to oral literature, isn't it? Like it's that oral tradition of having sort of a voice telling you things, and yet at the same time, I mean, it's self-consciously literary. I think in part because the profound learnedness of John B. McLemore. I mean, a character with such reading tastes, with such vocabulary, with such sort of idiosyncrasies. I mean, you couldn't have invented. I mean, it makes you rethink Faulkner and how much sort of how much imagination and how much just the marvelous South wrote his stories for him. And yeah, look, I think that it's the self-consciousness of the, sort of some of the structuring devices, the layering, the conscious use of motif, the revealing and the concealing, of points. I mean, I think that if that episode 7, what was the last one?
7, yeah.
7 had been, and of course any of that information that we were given in episode 7 could quite easily have been put into episode 2, episode 1, episode 3. So there's a conscious sort of plotting and withholding of information and also the revealing of information that makes the model of a novel a really useful way of thinking through that podcast, and it gives us a language to discuss it. I think is the best thing about it.
And I think they're also very self-consciously referring to themselves as literature, because they don't refer to the episodes as episodes. They actually call it as chapters.
Yeah.
It's chapter 1 through to chapter 7. So it's almost inviting you to, I was going to say read, but not necessarily read, but observe it as a form of literary work in itself.
Look, that absolutely did, because I mean, I think from the opening with the very intricate description of clock workings, you know, was immediately sort of a cue to anyone who does reading to sort of be on the lookout for metaphors of time, for the significance of, you know, sort of the machinery of clocks. And I mean, I think that yeah, look, I mean, I think that this one of the things that this podcast does is it sort of blows out of the water that lovely sort of ability to one hand to talk about form with sort of pleasurable detachment, and then on the other hand that the brutal sort of and the devastating life that brought into being that podcast, and I think that's where it becomes such a sort of a powerful thing to listen to, but also a really compelling thing to talk about.
I think that, like the best novels, it has the power to evoke a number of kind of contradictory emotions. So I was very, you know, engaged on a kind of entertainment level with the podcast, and it's, you know, it's wonderful listening. It's you know, compelling. It drives you forward, but at the same time, there is this deep sadness and this deep despair that underlies almost really all the episodes from the beginning, even when before it's revealed that he has committed suicide. So it has that ability to kind of exist within that complexity, I suppose, to not be one thing or another. It's not just a sad story. It's also a beautiful story. It's also it's a bittersweet story. It's a story about place. It's a story about murder. It's a story about science. It's a story about the experience of a gay man living in a world that's quite hostile to gay people. And at the same time, it's also really, really entertaining.
And because of the way it's structured, where, you know, sort of those final two chapters, I think really, in many respects, I feel sort of challenge or turn on its head the idea of it as detective fiction. And I actually, by the end of it, felt it was more of a love story and a tragedy, you know, which I think was only possible or only available to me as a listener because of that sort of crafted, you know, sort of structure and thoughtfulness that went into the piecing together of John B. McLemore's life.
And I think the other thing that also makes it really literary, we're going to look at it from that aspect, is the use of language. I mean, we've talked about the writer himself, you know, you mentioned, Michelle, the opening with that descriptive passages. But just even the, I was going to say characters, but well, they are in a way a form of characters themselves, and all the different people being interviewed, their use of language is spectacular. I mean, you know, John B. McLemore, obviously, but there were some other interviews that I just thought, wow, you know, that could have come out from any wonderful 19th or 20th century literary work. Faulkner, you mentioned at one stage.
Yeah, look, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because there have, of course, been complaints about, you know, sort of the way it represents, you know, S-Town and, you know, sort of the South and you know, all of those things. But I feel that the thing that I came away from listening to that story was, in actual fact, the profound eloquence of the people.
Yeah, I felt that too. The way that they spoke really surprised me, because I think we have in our head a kind of one-dimensional caricature of the redneck, and perhaps if we saw the way that they kind of fit into that kind of caricature of what the redneck looks like, it might kind of cut against our perception of them. But just having the audio and hearing their words, I thought, really kind of broke down that cliche of what the redneck is like, because they were so eloquent. And I don't know if it's something about the accent or the way they use language. Yeah.
Because there was a sort of an almost, I think, sort of biblical and sort of a really sort of King James sort of edition of the Bible as well in their diction, in their turns of phrases. It just lifted the level of the podcast, and in a sense that was something that only the language of those people could do. And I think the other thing that it did that's so very important for the times that we're in is that sort of on one hand we had John B. McLemore, who absolutely and utterly declared that population sort of racist, bigoted, ignorant, distasteful, corrupt, really unequivocally, using the language that that is usually divisive, and in actual fact it is. But then what we saw sort of human beings who both held views that I could never reconcile myself with, and yet were capable of incredible acts of empathy and understanding and just integrity
and profundity. I found it surprising how profound some of their kind of speculations. They all have a lot of interviews with neighbours and friends of John, and I found the way that they commented upon his life and the certain challenges that they found in his that he had in his life really profound. And I thought that's amazing that we kind of write off people based on kind of perceptions about what they'll be like, and certainly John did too, to some as you say. He's written off this town as full of loser deadbeats, basically. But the understanding and the insight that they seem to have into him and his life and the kind of struggles that he faced, as well as the kind of deeper psychological motivations of his behaviour, struck me as incredibly wise in ways that I wasn't expecting.
They gave him room. There was no. They accepted him as he was,
and I wish he could see that.
Look, it was one of those sort of moments where I think, on one hand we're given this sort of glimpse of the Southern Gothic, where that's deliberately invoked, and I think that the sort of the genius of it was that actually Reed understood that what we were going to see by the end of it was something that was actually transformative and surprising, and actually in the end challenged me, because it was almost as though those people with sort of their distinctly and in fact, it was overt, the fact that the KKK had no qualms or problems with being called the KKK, wood factory. There was no effort to disguise, sort of those things that you sort of think of as insurmountable, don't you? They tend to be the things that you think divide you, sunder you absolutely from people, and yet by the end of it, it felt as though everything was much more negotiable. Because we'd had this glimpse of the complexity of what it means to hold beliefs but still be, sort of human and profoundly kind.
Yeah, and I think also their understanding of how the implications or complexities of language works really sort of fleshes out a lot of these people. So one of the interviews that really surprised me was the grandmother Tyler. Her interview really just completely shocked me, because I wasn't expecting anything that sort of came out of that woman's mouth, and it was just such an amazing the things that she was saying were just really surprising for me, especially when she talked about listening to opera when she was in a bad mood. So whenever opera's playing, she's in a bad mood, and you listen to the pieces that she's playing, there's almost like another level of meaning that she's putting forth. There's a self-actualization that I just don't expect, I guess, and it's my own biases. I freely acknowledge that from those sort of from people who speak in that particular way, and that for me was really surprising.
Look, and I think the other thing that struck me, and I think probably all of us, because we've sort of been privileged with, sort of the sort of almost the highest level of education that you can access, in terms of sort of postgraduate study, or all of those things, and so many of the ideas that I think were being articulated by the grandmother, by the people in the church, as in the tattoo parlour, in terms of John B. McLemore, I was sort of made to feel how sort of knowledge and education can also deprive people of the richness of experiencing their life and coming towards their own forms of wisdom. Because I think one of the things that was very clear was that a lot of the, there were obviously the solicitor, and there was the, there were the town clerk and professor and things like that. But by and large, the town people, the real sort of main, sort of driving forces of that were people who'd left school, who'd, sort of not studied, and yet through, sort of time and through observation and through feeling and through, I guess, living in a particular sort of wholeness, made me question, made me question, I guess, the path to wisdom.
Well, I think that becomes clear in the conversation that he's had that Brian Reed has with his old university professor, because John B. McLemore, clearly to me, is a genius. Mm-hmm. The level of achievement that he had in his profession, his ability to kind of come to all of this understanding almost entirely self-directed, indicates to me that it's a rare intellect that he had. But yet he didn't find a place in any kind of educational model. He didn't find what he needed at school, he didn't find what he needed in university, he ended up dropping out, but yet he's got one of the finest minds that I think I've had the pleasure of accessing, and that is reinforced by the other people in the clockmaking industry that have indicated that his level of achievement was beyond anything that that they could kind of put their finger on. And so I think that made me also have those kinds of similar thoughts, Michelle, about how the institutions of higher education can often not be welcoming to those kinds of more off-the-wall, more eccentric geniuses, or just people who, march to the beat of their own drum. I think that it made me think about how kind of institutionalized higher education can be.
Well, I mean, there's that sort of discussion of Rancière where sort of education is a form of equivalence, and your ability to achieve is because you're actually equivalent to what any one state wants or one institution wants. And I mean, you think about the achievement of John B. McLemore in that town and his instrumental role in building the town, because I mean that was one of the other revelations that came through, and that was just so difficult to process, was the fact that the John B. McLemore that we encountered, that we felt so fond of and felt so real to us, was perhaps not even the John B. McLemore that was for most of his life. So that sort of decline, possibly due to the brain damage of mercury, but sort of his ability to build mazes, his ability to organise. Actually, before I forget, because if I don't, I think I'll have to re-podcast or something. But the final lines that he writes to Brian Reed, and I'd wanted to actually write a transcript so that we could read them, because in actual fact the eloquence and the depth and just the beauty of what he wrote was, I'll admit, I was having a weep in the car as I drove along, and it reminded me the power of language, the power of words, and when someone melds, as you say, sort of a great mind with and a really a wonderful choice of books. I mean, like this, going through and charting the books that were important to him was another one of those moments where, as a teacher of literature, I just wanted to to weep again with joy, probably.
And I think it was a really positive note to end from somebody who has been so negative about almost every aspect of his life, unreasonably negative, mind you. You know, as you mentioned, he helped build the town, and there was this constant theme in his life that everything he touches eventually just turns to shit. Hence the title, I think. There was that relationship that he had fostered with the guy, I can't remember his name now, who then moved to New York, and he thought that was a failed relationship. But again, as it turned out, that guy actually turned his life around in a very positive way and looked at John B. as somebody, as a benefactor. And the town, for all intents and purposes, did thrive. And so I think, that sense of being moved by that letter that you felt, Michelle, was something, again, I can mirror, because I thought it was such a really nice note to know that even at the end of his life, his last thoughts weren't a negative thought, as we've been revealed, as we've been told throughout, but rather a quite positive message to leave the world in, that he felt that life, he had accomplished some things in life at least.
Yeah, and I like a good book. Sometimes you have these memories of reading a really book that really works for you, that you really fall in love with, and you remember where you were and how old you were when you finished it. I have this vivid memory of, I listened to most of this on long walks, and I just have this very specific memory of where I was on my walk when I listened to those final, last 5 minutes of chapter 7. So I think that it shows you how kind of effective and powerful this piece of audio is, that I can pinpoint where on the street I was when I listened to these final episodes.
Me too.
Yeah.
I was on the M4, just about to pass the sign from Penrith, and this letter came on, and I thought, oh, this is heartbreaking. Why am I on the M4?
Yeah, I know. It's just got that an enormous power to kind of move you, and that I wasn't necessarily anticipating. And
also transport you as well.
Yeah.
It transports you into this world, and it may not be a pleasant world, but certainly a fascinating and beautiful world that I just absolutely love.
I could imagine and envisage S-Town, even though I've never been to the United States. I've never encountered an environment. No, I haven't. But I haven't encountered this kind of environment. But yet I could locate myself in it.
I think the other thing that you can't sort of ignore when thinking about why something makes you feel as though it's literary, or whether it's novel, or any of the terms that you want to enlist in order to express, I guess, pleasure in some sense, because that I think ultimately that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to laud it, is the fact that it actually sort of it manages to sort of crystallise certain sort of moments about the time that we're living in that seem to be the most important things to be thinking about. And when you think about what the list of those things are, I mean, of course there's the climate change, of course there's racism, and there's also the there's the idea of the sort of the limitations of our notions of sort of heteronormativity. There's
classism as well.
There's classism, but also on another level we have that. And I think the other thing I was thinking about was that moment where he talks, and it's about home and not being at home. Because he's at home, he can't leave home. It is his home. It's not his home. And one of the ways that he thinks through that is by imagining someone over in war-torn, I think it's Syria or Iraq, and imagining, well, I think I don't leave home for the same reason that I can't remember the name, but it was an Islamic name, wouldn't leave his home, even though he might be waiting for a bomb or this or that, because in some ineffable way we have a sense of connection to home, and that I think sort of that notion of home combined with his final speech, where he really actually talks about the fact that I'm happy because I know that I have sat in my kitchen at night time and I have thought deeply about the way that I've lived. And I think that notion of time and sort of the time and the motifs on those astrolabes, the motifs on the sundials, in this sort of frenetic world where we live, where we're sort of cramming our moments and we're cramming ourselves, and the way that we need to work, and the way that our days are just so starved of time. I think ultimately I felt that taking away from that, it was a point to sort of consider that link between having time and being human, because I think when we don't have time to think and to be, then we don't have time to be human.
I think the episode that really moved me the most, and it's an episode I've seen a lot of criticism of, but I don't necessarily agree with the criticism, was Chapter 6. And that episode is, or that chapter is very much interested in looking at the fact of John's homosexuality or bisexuality, or however you want to think about it, and this kind of missed connection that he had with that man. And it struck me as such a lonely kind of episode, because it's all about him using the kind of slivers of time that he has at night and so forth to talk to this man on the internet, and to build up this connection with this man. But it's a missed connection. It's a could have been. And it struck me as so profoundly sad that they could have had something potentially, and it never eventuated. But at the same time, it was still real and still worthwhile in and of itself.
I think it's. I mean, if this were a novel, we'd talk about irony. Because obviously his conversations were on the telephone, and everyone that knew John had, sort of said that their friendship was marked by hours and hours on the telephone. And, when we think about how rich our experience of the podcast was by being channeled just through
audio,
sort of the lusciousness of the human voice, the disembodied voice, you sort of came to understand that there's this strange richness and intimacy that comes from, sort of that voice. And
that's right.
So it was just one of those moments where, and this is where I think that and in some sense you could almost invert the formula and say, sort of, as we discuss all of these aspects of sort of S-Town, it's actually a really good way into novels and into literature, because I think sort of perhaps that oral medium makes it much easier for people to feel these things that I think we probably feel more automatically in and with words and through words on the page.
Well, I've often thought that the power of podcasts is their intimacy. You're carrying around somebody's voice in your ear. I listen to, as you guys know, I listen to an absurd amount of podcasts, and I've often thought that is the kind of secret to the popularity of podcasts, is that you are carrying around somebody's thoughts, and you feel like you've developed relationships with them, even though you're just a passive listener walking around the streets listening. You feel like you've developed this kind of friendship with the hosts or the characters or the whatever is kind of relevant for that podcast. And again, I think there's a nice mirror there with the phone calls that he has.
Look, and I think it's an antidote to the sort of image-saturated world that we're living in. And I think one of the things that happens is that we forget that, sort of, I guess in many respects, the origins of much magic, sort of that sense of incantation, it all relies upon the human voice and listening to that rich textured, sort of soundscape.
And listening to people, we tend to do a lot of our communication by email and typing and all of that, and that's fine, that's great. But listening to people is something that I feel like we've lost, and that's, I think, the kind of hole that podcasts can fill. That listening to somebody's story played out over an hour. When was the last time you had an hour-long conversation with somebody?
And learning to listen, because I mean I've experienced this just in our podcast. Sort of that reminder, that remembering not to cut somebody off, not to interject, not to sort of want to take over too much space. And I think
the importance of listening. Yeah.
The importance of listening. Sort of on all its levels, and that was complete, because you really are captivated, aren't you? You're under the spell of that human voice.
That's
and right. I was absolutely willingly captivated through sort of that podcast. So I am eternally grateful to you both, because I've never listened to a podcast before then, and I can't imagine any podcast that would have so immediately converted me, because I am a convert.
She was a podcast host before she was a podcast listener.
And I think that it also harks back to maybe something from our youth that we've forgotten, which is that one of our first experience with stories or narrative is through storytelling, is through people reading out stories to us. You know, in kindergarten, your teacher would always read a story to you, so it was always the voice telling you a particular story, and that's how we get into literature to begin with, because we can hear and understand before we can actually read. And it is going back to almost that childhood state of listening to a well-told story. And I think, going back to your point, Steph, on chapter 6, it is also my favourite chapter as well, and it has caused a lot of controversy, which I would like to talk about in a little while. But the one thing that I also noticed, which sort of maybe completes our discussion about the literary aspect of it anyway, is there's a really strong intertextual element to that particular chapter. So their favourite, or I've forgotten his name now.
Olin.
Yeah.
Olin?
Something like that.
Yeah, it was him.
Yeah.
His favourite film was Brokeback Mountain, and he sends John B. McLemore the short story version of it, and then he also loves it too. And I couldn't help but notice the parallels between their relationships and the relationship of Jack and Ennis from Brokeback Mountain as well. Everything it almost mirrored their story to some degree, and they both proclaim it as their favourite story. They cry over this story, and the tragedy is they end in the exact same way for this story.
With one dead and one alive.
With one dead and one alive, and one not finding out until later because he gets, he tries to contact the other and finds out that the other is deceased. That's exactly what happens in Brokeback Mountain too.
Wow, I hadn't actually thought of that.
Yes, he sends the postcard, and the postcard comes back stamped deceased, and that's exactly what what's his name again?
Olin, yeah, something like that. Yeah.
That's what he did. He leaves a message and then gets no response, so he finds in the obituary and learns that John B. McLemore was dead. And the fact that nobody knew about this guy as well was another thing that paralleled Brokeback Mountain, because it was a secret relationship, and John B. never spoke about it. It's meant to be, 10, 12-year relationship, and there was never any indication until chapter 6 that, hang on, there was this person that actually existed, this person he was really close to. So I couldn't help but notice this interesting parallel between literature or art and life, and for me that was infinitely sad and moving.
That's a fantastic connection, because I've obviously noted that kind of Brokeback Mountain, the place that Brokeback Mountain had in their lives, but I hadn't kind of thought about that, the kind of way that the weird ways that their stories parallel. And I found it really profoundly sad that he had all of these secret relationships that he couldn't tell anybody about, and that half the people on that list of people that he asked that be notified of his death were people that were unknown to his family even. I found that really, really shocking. I thought we'd touch too on the controversy. So a lot of the controversy around that episode in particular, and especially in chapter 7, where there's discussion of church, which is the rituals of the tattooing and the sadomasochistic rituals that they go through, were overstepping the mark. So there was a lot of discussion about whether that was actually Brian Reed's place to reveal those kinds of personal details about his life, given that when he called Brian Reed into the town, it was about something very quite different. I don't know how you guys feel about that. I kind of feel that my own personal kind of feeling about that was I wasn't necessarily bothered by that. I did think that he was using the kind of murder that opens chapter 1 as a kind of excuse to have all these kind of much more interesting kind of emotional conversations, but I'm not sure how you guys feel.
I mean, I've been bothered by that particular ethical situation with other texts, most prominently with The Making of a Murderer, which I stopped watching after 3 episodes because I just couldn't handle the way that they were depicting the woman who got killed, or rather not depicting her and using her death almost as a medium to entertain us. So I felt I had strong conflicting issues with that particular series. But with this one, it never once occurred to my mind at all that there was anything problematic, mainly because I think it was... I felt that it was actually just such a celebration of the life of John B. McLemore with all its complexities, in a way that, if God forbidding I should pass away, I would like my life to be depicted in this way. I don't want it to be shown as this one-sided picture of only the positive aspect, but rather all the complexities that happened. And if the complexities involve other aspect that I have already expressed that I'm okay with talking about, I think Brian Reed was very, very respectful of that, and he made sure that he had permission from every single aspect before.
Look, I'm also really I'm feeling quite cautious and quite negative about sort of people. I'm interested in people's objections to it, because first of all, we know that John B. McLemore, an atheist. Life is over. He contacted Brian Reed. He flashed his tattoos to him. You know, I think that, you know, sort of on that level, you know, I couldn't think of a problem, an ethical problem. Okay, but then I think on another level, I think there's this, you know, for somebody speaking on behalf of Brian B. McLemore to say that it was too much revealing this, or it's an ethical, you know, sort of it's the wrong thing ethically to do, tells me that they're thinking that the most important thing in the whole world is, you know, an individual's right to privacy, you know, that right to being invisible or protected, or all of those sorts of things. And what I think that art does is that it crosses boundaries that makes us really uncomfortable. It transgresses. It calls into question our priorities, and, you know, sort of that emphasis on the individual over the community is one of the forces that are fracturing our world, because we can't actually put anyone, including ourselves, we can't allow, you know, sort of the individual to constantly determine all of our decision-making processes in a way that sort of prevents things like this from happening. Because I think when you look at the things that, and it's not sort of, I don't want to head into a sort of utilitarian sort of thing, because it's useful to the world, he must be revealed, you know, his life must be revealed. But I still think that there's a sort of a knee-jerk reaction that shows the degree to which we sort of are we're sort of driven by an individualistic and sort of almost sort of an individualistic drive over, you know, sort of other aspects of, you know, sort of art, which are uncomfortable and are problematic and do raise questions and do challenge us and are inappropriate and all of those things. But I don't think that that's a reason to be silent.
I completely agree, and I thought that those aspects of the series actually enhanced my understanding of this man, because I mean, when you strip away that sort of more private material, what you're left with is John B's proclamations about his life, which are often incredibly biased, leave out a lot of details, are, you know, well, everyone's biased, everyone's subjective, but without that kind of added richness of those stories about his personal life, I think you would be left just with this one-sided view that he had created of the town. And not only that, you would also be left with what I found a far less compelling narrative of where the gold was in the backyard. And I mean, that was kind of interesting on a, you know, this is you know, this is insane, like this man may have, you know, millions of dollars of gold buried under his house. That's a kind of colour detail, but that to me wasn't the crux of this story.
Look, and I think that was the other thing that troubles me about criticism of, you know, sort of talking openly about, you know, sort of John B. McLemore's lovers, about, you know, sort of the tattooing and the, you know, sort of the piercing, is this idea that we are discreet, you know, that we have these sort of really sort of clear-cut boundaries, and I'm here, you're there, and this, because I think the truth is much more complex. And when you look at what John B. McLemore, you know, sort of what a life is, it's the networks of connections that we have with people, with places, with knowledge, with you know, our actions, and to sort of, you know, to sort of reduce a human being to that, you know, sort of that bodily outline and say, well, that border can't be crossed. And also I think that it smacks of the institution too, and that really bugs me, because I think what we see is someone who is negotiating mental illness in a way that, you know, wouldn't tick any boxes for any, you know, sort of society. And yet I think we have to look at and think, well, wasn't he better off, you know, sort of living where he was, going to his church, than, you know, sort of locked up, institutionalized, and, you know, all medicated, of those sorts, and medicated. I mean, it was challenging. I think it was challenging to the prevailing ideas that we have around, you know, sort of mental illness, and I think it also demonstrated, you know, sort of the, you know, sort of it demonstrated that, in sort of a way that made it so visceral, the experience of mental illness, where, you know, sort of tattooing upon tattooing, or tattooing upon wounds, and piercing and re-piercing, was the sort of the holiday.
He needed to feel that in order to feel
the respite from what his mental anguish is, and I think that we eschew the idea of, you know, sort of the you know, sort of I think we're not comfortable with the degree to which, you know, sort of violence is part of a range of experiences, and I think we're not comfortable with it. And of course, it's not anything that, you know, you'd want for anyone to experience. But at the same time, to pretend that it's not there is feels something.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have an issue with the actual violence of it. I do understand the whole ethical argument, but a point that I do have, which it's pure speculation, there's no proof anywhere that this is the case, but it's something that I was thinking about during the entire series, is that I think John B. McLemore actually invited the story to come in. You know, he used the crime, which he knew was not true. You know, he's too intelligent of a man to believe these sort of things. I think he used it as an excuse to lure somebody else into his life, somebody who could, in a way, reveal the complexities of his life in a way that he wanted it to reveal. As I said, it's pure speculation on my part, but, you know, that's the sense that I got. He was too smart a man to be used or manipulated in this way. If anything, he was the one who was instigating a lot of these things.
Well, I think
himself.
that was visible when Brian Reed was questioning him and saying that there actually doesn't seem to be much evidence that this happened, and he kind of changed the subject. I think he was.
No, think about this.
Think about this. It seemed to me, that he was playing that game of, you know, I'm going to use this as a kind of hook, because I know what kind of stories This American Life puts out, and so forth, and to draw this in. But actually, the real story I want to tell is about me.
Yeah, and he knows their reputation for delving into people's lives and delving into the complexities of people's lives too. So you don't contact an organisation that does something like that when you want privacy for yourself.
That's right.
You don't.
He invited them there.
He invited them.
Yes,
you don't subject yourself to that.
Look, and I think also it would be insulting to him not to acknowledge the fact that he was a literary man. I mean, the 3 books that he sent, you know, sort of Brian Reed to read, that frame, you know, sort of his very first experience down in S-Town, were, you know, Guy Maupassant, the necklace, and the
Shirley Jackson.
Shirley Jackson, and the Faulkner. And then the very
which ended up being the theme song at the end, mind you.
And then the very last, you know, sort of the list of the books that he actually uses to say, well, when I'm weighing up whether my life has been worthwhile, whether it's been a good life. The list of books that he names, that there is no way that the idea of the, you know, sort of the artful and you know, sort of arrangement of life is anathema to what John B. McLemore intended, thought, or desired.
I think he was well aware of what was happening and where the story was going, and I you know, obviously I can't know what was in his head, but I agree with Jimmy that it does seem to me that he was involved in that conscious construction of his life into a work of art, really. I also, before we go, I wanted to touch on the way that this series was presented to us, because unlike most podcasts, it wasn't released in a timed way, you know, 1 episode every week or every 2 weeks. It was dropped all in one go, so it was available to be listened to in one binge session if you wanted, or you could listen to it over however long you cared to. How do you think that kind of shaped the listening experience for you?
Well, you know, if we're going with the literary thing, for me, it's giving you the option of doing whatever you want to in a way that a book gives you the same option. You can read the entire book in one sitting if you choose to, which, knowing my habit, I tend to. If I'm really into a book, I'll just sit there from morning through to the wee hours of the morning, reading the entire book. But at other times, if you're busy, it does give you the option to go from chapter to chapter, which also has that niceness to it too, because it gives you something to think about or to process between each chapter. And to be honest, I didn't have the time, as I would have liked to just binge on this entire series and do 7 hours sitting. So I did listen to it as I was driving to and from work every single time.
It did seem to me that the structure was much more like a novel than that kind of episodic TV kind of approach of dropping an episode once a week or once every 2 weeks or something like Serial was dropped. So therefore it was much more kind of, what happened on the last episode was the kind of discussion of the week. This you could kind of consume at your leisure.
There's also the other unspeakable option, which is to skip to the end or skip around and not
Michelle,
actually
I'll
read
pretend
it
you didn't say
end.
that.
I know.
We don't do that
but
with
it
books.
is actually but it is actually the possibility of having it given to you all at once. And
that's right. That is true.
It is absolutely. I guess it's that delight where you can either just lose yourself in it, or also skip ahead, or not that I did that.
Or control the listening experience in some way. Yeah.
And I think it's fair to say that all three of us did lose ourselves.
Yeah,
in this
absolutely.
Podcast.
I listened to it over the course of, I think, a little bit less than a week, maybe about 5 days, something like that. And I did feel pretty immersed in the story. I was thinking about it when I was, walking around and looking forward to getting back to it. So I think it had that immersive kind of novel reading experience for me.
And I think also, like a good novel, it does. I don't know about you guys, but certainly I had a very cathartic experience by the end of it. It was pleasant by the end, in a horrifyingly painful and heartbreaking way. But at the end, you sort of felt it was a satisfying ending.
I think that the word that sort of stuck out for me at the end was bittersweet. That I felt that I'd had this amazingly sad experience of going along, learning about this guy's life, but I also felt like it was one of the most beautiful kind of stories that I'd really encountered, and I think it'll stay with all of us for a long time. So I think that's 3 very enthusiastic thumbs up for S-Town. So I hope that you also enjoyed listening to S-Town and our discussion of S-Town. All this podcasting about podcasts is making my head spin. We'll be with you again in another 2 weeks. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you.
And thanks, Jimmy.
Thank you, both of you.
See you again soon. Bye.